Good evening, everyone. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. It is a pleasure to welcome this panel tonight to discuss Detroit's economic revitalization and what Chicago and other cities can learn from it. After all, Chicago has already learned to embrace square-cut pizza, so if there are a few more lessons we can take from our friends in the Motor City, we're eager to do so. I do want to mention a few upcoming events. Actually, I want to mention one last upcoming event because it's our last public program of the quarter. On Thursday, we will be hosting a live taping of the Axe Files with presidential candidate Andrew Yang. It is sold out, but it will be available on live streams. We hope you'll tune in. We've also announced a new project on the intersection of music and politics called the Jukebox Ballot. If you're a student and want to tell us about a song that reflects or shaped your political outlook, or one that you associate with a political event in your life, please nominate it and add it to our playlist. Check out jukeboxballot.com for more info. In the next few weeks, we're going to be starting to announce our programming lineup for January and February. To make sure you're the first to know about our events, please go to our website at politics.uchicago.edu. After tonight's conversation, we will be having questions from the audience. The microphone will be just over in this aisle here. And as usual, we ask that the first three questions be from students. We also asked that you remember that questions end in question marks. Please make sure that your phones are on silent. And if you need them, the restrooms are downstairs. And now, formally introducing our panel is Sarish Salim. Sarish is a master's student at the Harris School of Public Policy, and she is from the Detroit area. This year, she has been a mayoral fellow for the city of Chicago, so has an interest in tonight's topic. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's event. As Gretchen mentioned, I'm a native of the Detroit area and current longtime Chicagoan, so the topic of this event literally hits close to home. I had just graduated from undergrad and left the area when Detroit declared bankruptcy in 2013. But I had the incredible opportunity of watching the city's rebirth from afar. And now, 7 years later, Detroit is thriving, thanks in part to the work of our incredible guests this evening. Architect and urban planner Maurice Cox currently serves as the commissioner of the Chicago Department of Planning and Development. Prior to coming to Chicago, he was the director of planning for the city of Detroit, where he served for 4 years. While in Detroit, Commissioner Cox laid the groundwork for Detroit's revitalization with a variety of new plans, including Detroit's $130 million Strategic Neighborhood Fund. Sonja Maze is the president and CEO of Develop Detroit, a real estate development company that focuses on building mixed-income communities and single-family homes across Detroit. Ms. Maze is a native Detroiter as well and currently serves on Detroit Public Schools' Community District Board. September Hargrove is the vice president and Detroit program officer for JPMorgan Chase. As part of the Advancing Cities team, she helps manage the firm's $200 million commitment to Detroit to increase economic opportunity for underserved individuals and communities. Prior to joining JPMorgan Chase, she served as the National Network Director for CDFI Association for Enterprise Opportunity and was a White House Fellow during the Obama administration. This conversation will be moderated by Ann Dodge, Executive Director of the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation here at the University of Chicago. Prior to joining Mansueto, Ann led UChicago Urban, where she worked to make the university's urban research more transparent and accessible. Please join me in welcoming our guests for this evening.
Thank you all. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Ann Dodge. I'm so happy to be here. Urban planning is my favorite thing. I have a degree in city planning. I take it very seriously. I also have noticed since I've been here at U of Chicago for 5 years, there's a real interest among our students in what is this? What is this field? What does it look like? So hopefully this conversation can give you all some insights into that. But let's go to the panel. We had great introductions about all these people, but I was hoping you could each tell us a little bit about yourselves, your work, maybe 30 seconds, and then we'll go in to Detroit.
Ladies, you want to start?
Should I start? I'll start. Hi, everyone. As was mentioned earlier, my name is Sonja Maze. I am currently the president and CEO of a nonprofit called Develop Detroit. A little bit later, I'll talk about what that work entails in Detroit. As recently as 7 years ago, I was working on Wall Street as an investment banker. It's a little bit surreal that I'm actually sitting here having this conversation. This is not at all the career path that I sketched out 10 years ago, let's just say that. About 6.5 years ago, I got called back home to my hometown to work on the bankruptcy, and I wound up being one of just a handful of people who managed and led Detroit's bankruptcy over a period of 2 years. That work was so incredibly compelling and deeply resonated with me that I decided to stay in Detroit instead of going back to the East Coast. And I'm the founding CEO of a community real estate development company that's really focused on revitalizing Detroit's neighborhoods block by block.
Good evening, everyone. My name is September Hargrove. I'm really excited to be here. I am a fan of the Institute of Politics. I remember being in an audience like this and looking up at the stage, and to be on the stage is kind of surreal. But I lead JPMorgan Chase's investment in Detroit. It's a $200 million commitment that we've made that will reach by the end of 2022, which is really focused on how we can continue to support the city in their economic revitalization. Prior to this, most of my career has really been in the government space. I've worked for the governor of California, the mayor of New Orleans, and President Obama. But I have two real passions. I guess it's policy and cities. And so in the work that I do in Detroit as a grant maker, it gives me the opportunity to kind of really have influence over both of those by being able to support amazing organizations like Develop Detroit that's led by Sonja Maze.
So hello, everyone. I'm Maurice Cox, the newly appointed Commissioner of Planning and Development for Chicago, originally from New York. And this is, I guess, the second Midwestern city I've lived in. I had the very good fortune of being the planning director for Detroit as it came out of bankruptcy and started to try to imagine a future for the city, a city that was going to grow again. And I think some of the work we did helped to change the national narrative about Detroit and to effectively give residents who stuck it out with the city evidence that their future was going to be quite different and much more prosperous. So hope to talk a little bit about that and some lessons that we might learn from Detroit tonight.
Great. Come back to that changing the national narrative thing a little later, because I think that's an interesting subject for Chicago. But I was hoping we could start with Sonja, because you've been there the longest of all of this team. What drew you back? What kept you there? And what's keeping you there now?
Well, let me start with what drew me back. If you get a call from someone, and the man who ran the bankruptcy, his name is Kevin Orr. He was this big-time bankrupt. He was and still is this big-time bankruptcy attorney based in D.C. But if you get a call from your hometown that basically goes, hey, the city has hit financial rock bottom. There's no other place to go but bankruptcy. And oh, by the way, it's going to be the biggest municipal bankruptcy, certainly in the country, potentially in the world. I think you just have to answer that call, right? Like you have to at least consider it, which is what I did. And I walked away from from a career on Wall Street, which for people who are on Wall Street is kind of like the pinnacle of it's what you go to school for, it's what you go to business school for. And I walked away from that because I knew how important that moment was in Detroit for my hometown. I knew that there was an incredible amount of weight hanging around getting that work done right? And I have aging parents who live in Detroit. My entire family's in Detroit. And it really mattered to me on a very personal level that the street lights were going to be working, that the police would come when they're called, that the fire department would show up. Like this wasn't some theoretical case study. This was like, these were lives to me. And so I had a skill set. I had deep passion about it. And it was a detour, but it was one that I felt like was incredibly important for the future of 700,000 residents. And so the second part of that question was what?
You're still there. Well, I want to
Yeah.
know, I'd love to ask you a little bit about what you think the future looks like and what's your dream for Detroit in 20 years. But I'm interested in what it looks like now. We're, 5 years out of the bankruptcy? What have you seen change?
Yeah. You almost can't describe how badly government had failed back in 2012, 2013. Like, I don't know how many people have worked in government at all in this room. So maybe I didn't have a government experience, and so I was really shocked and blown away by how deteriorated just the basic functioning of government was. Mm-hmm. For those of you who have that perspective, maybe it would not have registered so shocking. But I was really struck through that period of 2 years. The bankruptcy lasted for 2 years. By the fact that anything got done at all. It was like government was being held together by, duct tape almost. And I'm exaggerating, but there's a lot of, there's a measure of truth in that. Over the last 6 years, and a good percentage of this change has really come post the bankruptcy, and the way the bankruptcy set the table so that you could have all of this change and the stability rush into Detroit. But what I've watched over the last 4 to 5 years in Detroit is things that I never imagined in my hometown, right? Like people are moving there who don't have ties to Detroit. Mm-hmm. This is a very unusual thing for my hometown. Like Detroit for 40 or 50 years was the place that young people ran from. Mm-hmm. And now young people are coming there. They want to work for the mayor's office. We're able to get like really talented leaders like September and Maurice to move and come and do good work there. So that's the biggest change that I've seen is just the flat-out change in perception and how that's led to this uptick in talent. And slowly but surely, government is starting to restore faith, if you will. I like to describe Detroit when I got there as a series of systems and processes that had come up around scarcity and decline and financial collapse, right? So everything was about how do we do more with less? Next year, how do we do less how do we do more with 25% less resource, right? And so that was the system of government that we had when I got there in 2013. And over the last 5 or 6 years, we have a phenomenal mayor now who has really just very tactically started to rebuild those systems. So now you can come in and have a conversation about how you invest in Detroit. Now you can come in and have a conversation about how do you open a business. So those are some of the really significant changes that I've seen over the last few years.
Yeah. And tell me if I'm wrong, but I think, Maurice, you were the next one to arrive.
Yes? I think
right?
so.
Yeah.
I arrived in February 2015.
Okay.
Probably the day after the biggest snowstorm in quite some time. Welcome to Detroit. And I was brought there by a mayor, Mayor Duggan, who had really started to rebuild the systems. And he was assembling his cabinet in a way I think was really quite ingenious. He had people who knew Detroit deeply, and he mixed in people from around the country in pretty high-profile positions. And he knew that planning was going to have to be central to reimagining Detroit. And so he went with somebody who is not trained as a planner. I was trained as an architect. I was a tenured faculty member, and he found me and said, that's the guy I want. I want somebody who is about ideas, who will innovate, and who hasn't bought into this notion that somehow the challenge of Detroit is how you manage its decline, which there were a lot of people who were interviewed for my job who thought it's about how you manage the city's decline. And I went in there talking about how we grow the city again and how we can honor those people who stuck it out, 700,000 of them. And we owe it to them to allow them to shape the future. And so we kind of started from that assumption, well, we're going to work with those who are here. We're going to try to make a city that does more than just the basic services, that creates a quality of life with the particular assets that we had available to us. And that's the process that I was asked to lead. I think something about the bankruptcy and this notion that you've hit rock bottom, and so you have the perfect crisis. Nobody can claim that what we've been doing is working, because clearly it's not. So you think about how that opens up a community to new ideas. So it felt like Detroiters were ready for a creative response. And I often say, I don't know if any of you have ever met anyone that went through a bankruptcy, but they have this pep in their step. You know, they're just released from this crippling debt, and they can start over again. So imagine a city that feels that they can start over again. And I think, obviously, that was part of the talent attraction as well.
Yeah. Well, this is, I've noticed in what both of you said, there's a sort of an asset-based framing around all of this. And I'm hoping this is going to come to Chicago. But let's talk a little bit about what brought you to Detroit and how long you've been there, and what sort of, how was it presented to you as an opportunity?
So I am the newest on this panel of Detroiters. I actually moved in March, but JPMorgan Chase's story in Detroit actually goes back more than 85 years. As a firm, we've been doing business there. And in 2014, at a shareholders meeting, the topic of Detroit came up. We weren't in Detroit. Detroit wasn't on the agenda, yet the story of Detroit deeply penetrated the conversation and what would follow there afterwards. And so it was at that time that our CEO, Jamie Dimon, went to the head of corporate responsibility, Peter Scheer, and told him, go to Detroit and see what's going on. Well, how can we help? What can we do? And from that, they reached out to Mayor Duggan, who had just been elected as a write-in mayor. And for those of you who all raised your hand about working in government, like that's unheard of. As an individual who's, walking the streets, getting those votes. So for us, I think that was kind of this interesting set of conditions that had come together. You have the bankruptcy, so this ability to breathe fresh life into a city, a new mayor that is very bullish about his approach, and it's by any means necessary, we're going to do what it takes to think about what the future looks like for those have stayed. You've got tables where funders have come together and collaborated in a way that probably hadn't existed before to be able to save some of those assets of the city. And then kind of, you had a plan. The Detroit Future City, which is a local kind of think tank, had started to put together kind of a plan of action that could be used in terms of what the steps forward. So when we brought our team to Detroit, it started with just listening. We didn't come in with a set of priorities or a plan for what we thought could save Detroit, but rather we wanted to sit down with people like Sonja and Maurice and get a sense from them of, where do you see as the biggest challenges, the biggest opportunities, and where can we be of most value in terms of leveraging our philanthropic dollars, but even more so than that, our approach is thinking about the full force of the firm. And so our original commitment started with $100 million that we would deploy over 5 years, really focusing in the early days around kind of neighborhood revitalization, blight, thinking about how could we start to support the city as it's thinking about its infrastructure challenges, and then also around how do you start to redevelop kind of the commercial commerce in the neighborhoods, thinking about small business, and then the big challenge around workforce and understanding the disconnect between the high number of Detroiters that were either unemployed or having to leave the city to the suburbs for entry-level jobs because the employers, you've got people that are training for positions that the employers aren't hiring for. So we did a lot of early days of our work around that. But I realized you asked me more specifically about me and not so much about JPMorgan Chase. So all of that essentially led me to the city because I worked there for the firm. But my decision to transition from New York, where I started working with JPMorgan Chase in November of 2017, I had already been working on the Detroit portfolio as part of the Advancing Cities team, which is really thinking about how do you take this Detroit model and export it to other cities like Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Paris, where we have these similar type commitments. But for me, it was that it reminded me of the feeling that I had when I went to New Orleans for the first time, that I could have an impact. Like I personally could do something that is going to actually make a difference. And I don't think that we as individuals get a lot of opportunities in life where you could be a part of something, you could build something, but where you would just as an individual just showing up means something different. And so the decision for me and my now husband to relocate was the combination of being in a role where I could represent the firm and the investment that we had, but where I personally could move into a neighborhood, buy a home, and demonstrate in my personal and professional life the difference that I wanted to have in the community. And so that was the attractive thing that led me there.
It really feels from all of you like there was a sense of you're just champions. You wanted to champion this place. You wanted to see it. You wanted to go somewhere where you could see change, right?
In a city that has, it's an iconic city. I mean, everybody worldwide has some notion of Detroit, whether it's, you grew up in the 60s and the Motown gave you the soundtrack of your youth, or the automobile industry and the central role that it played in our love affair with cars, to techno music. It was, I know Chicago house and all that, but techno was founded in Detroit and went worldwide, and so everybody knows about this iconic American city. They also knew that it was dying, and that maybe in our lifetime we're going to see a great American city die. And you think about, that's pretty deep. I don't think we've ever seen that before. And so when there are signs that you can actually change the course of history just by being there, I think it brought you back. It brought major investors to the table. It just fueled everyone's imagination that we could actually change the course of history. And I think it's playing out in real time, and I think it gives a lot of cities hope that you aren't just a victim of your fate isn't sealed by 50 years of decline. That you can change it, and you can change it like literally. It can happen in 5-10 years, and I think that's what's playing out now.
Yeah.
If I can lift something up in what you said, something that I think is pretty important and really essential to the story of what's pulling people to Detroit. In a lot of ways, Detroit is the canary in the coal mine in terms of social issues. If you think about the decline of the manufacturing base, it started in Detroit. If you think about some of patterns of white flight, Detroit. If you think about the degradation of the public school system, our problems are really deep, but they're the type of problems that you're starting to see pop up in a lot of other, particularly urban centers, but not exclusively urban centers. And I think for people who are problem solvers, for people who really like to think deeply about challenge and are really passionate about public service, there's really no better place to tinker with ideas and to innovate than Detroit right now. And in a lot of the problems that we're grappling with in Detroit, they have solutions, and they have solutions that are going to be highly portable to other places. And we're starting to see that. Like, I think we see a little bit of that with some of the work that Detroit's done with demolition. A lot of the work that JPMorgan Chase has done I don't want to speak for you, but I assume is going to start to get ported out to other places. And then, of course, in the poaching of our planning director.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about that. What are you bringing? What are you exporting via JPMorgan's machine, and what are you going to bring from Detroit to Chicago?
So I think our best example of something that's been exported has been our Entrepreneurs of Color Fund. And this was a fund that was created in partnership with initially the Kellogg Foundation and Detroit Development Fund in 2015. And it focused on how we could help entrepreneurs of color get more access to capital, especially those that had been denied bank loans from traditional lenders. And as a financial institution, kind of saying that and being intentional about how we can help individuals that are locked out of access to No worries. Can y'all hear me? All right. Awesome. So it was being able to kind of create this program that not only just focused on the capital piece, but also taking it a step further to understand what else do entrepreneurs need, and it's the technical assistance, that dedicated support to be able to help them think through their business plan, getting them loan ready, thinking about opening and sustaining that business. And so we started that fund first in Detroit, and we've now been able to export that to 5 other cities, including Chicago, as well as be able to scale the program in Detroit. We grew the fund from initially $6.5 million to now it's $22 million, and we've been able to support over 90 entrepreneurs, a majority of which are in the neighborhoods, be able to open and grow their businesses.
Yeah, I mean, I think this whole notion of who is going to rebuild Detroit was central to the post-bankruptcy narrative. So Detroit is also the largest majority African-American city in America. And so it's 80% African-American, 10% Latino, and 10% white. And color divide is urban-suburban. It's not like in Chicago, where it's north and south and west, inside the city boundaries. And so it was kind of clear that if we were going to have a recovery, if we were going to grow again, the question about how we were going to grow and who is developing our neighborhoods was a big question. And it had to be diverse. It had to be inclusive. And so having a Entrepreneurs of Color fund or having an emerging developer fund that would take people who had the skills but perhaps didn't have access to resource or needed some capacity building and get them ready to be centrally a part of rebuilding the city. I think that was central to our agenda and who we invested in and why. So you have a company like Sonja's company, which was born really post-bankruptcy. But we knew that she was going to be one of those players to rebuild the city. And we had to find, I would like to say dozens, because that's a hard thing to do, but we had to find other Sonja Mazes and prepare them for opportunity. And some of it is self-evident. It's very difficult to go into 98% African-American community and bring with you a load of white developers. Either just like you're met with amazing suspicion, and there is, so just the notion that those who are going to plan the city look like the city they're planning, those who are going to build the city look like the city that they're building in, that was just a norm. We just understood that was the way things were going to have to be, and that we were going to partner with all those who were willing to come along with this notion of a much more inclusive way of growing the city, starting from the folks who are there. Now, again, you go to another city like Chicago, and I think Chicago is really blessed at this moment to have a population distribution, which is like, it's like the ultimate rainbow coalition, a third, and other. Like how many cities would just kill for that kind of diversity? So now the question is Chicago, is that going to be reflected in who develops Chicago and how Chicago grows? So in a way, that lens that I guess I sharpened in Detroit, I bring that same lens to Chicago, and I just expect inclusion. I expect diversity, and that's going to be part of the challenge that I have in a city that has a different history relative to race and class and geography.
Yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit about the differences and what you have encountered so far. I also wanted to throw out there for your response that I heard recently on the radio someone referring to Chicago as a city that was 1/3 Silicon Valley, 2/3 Detroit.
I heard that too.
Don't shoot the messenger, I just heard it. But I'd really love to know, you all have had some experience here. Maurice, you now have more. Mm-hmm. Does that seem like an apt comparison?
The contrasts here are so much more stark and quite frankly troubling. than they are in Detroit. Because I would argue Detroit is like, it's coming back. But if you go downtown, you know, it's still in the process of becoming. And whereas, you know, downtown Chicago has arrived. I mean, it's a global mecca. You hear all kinds of languages talked in the street. There are dozens and dozens of cranes everywhere. It's so clear that you live in a global city. Then you can go to the far west side in Austin, or you can go to the far south side in Pullman, and you think you're living in another city. You can't recognize this as being in the same city. In Detroit, I don't think the contrasts are that dramatic. The neighborhoods are struggling, and the downtown is doing better, but you know, it's still becoming. In Chicago, the contrasts are dramatic, and I've had this experience of touring with aldermen where I'll be on the far south side, and I could swear I was back in Detroit. And then I'll go to a neighborhood on the north side, and oh my God, I think, wow, what a life. Beautiful here. What city is this? Oh, it's the same city. And now the question is, how do you create some type of equity? How do you just address that inherent inequity that has been building for a half century? And I actually believe that we now have an administration that's willing to take it on.
So I'm not as familiar with Chicago, but I would love, you know, if Sonja, how she would respond to what I'm about to say. But I do think that in Detroit, we still have that deep inequity. And it's maybe not so much from a you know, demographic, but it's more from socioeconomic. It is a very poor city.
It is.
The average median income is less than $30,000. Like the high level of poverty, especially among youth poverty, I think that I see as one of the biggest challenges that we have to overcome as a city is like, how do you overcome poverty? Because at the root of a lot of the challenges, it stems to the lack of opportunity. And you know, that gets all the way into the education system, like from a systemic way that the city has, you know, developed over time or through its decline. I think that has been the one thing that I see is persistent and is going to be the biggest challenge of how do we get over this, because as the downtown is starting to be more developed, it's becoming, you know, its next iteration of itself. When you're downtown, it feels different than the neighborhoods in terms of who's represented there, who's being able to participate in this redefined version of Detroit. And then you go to the neighborhoods and you're wondering, you know, when is going to be their time? And that's one of the things that I really love about the work that Sonja's been doing in the North End, is that she is, you know, a rock's throw from downtown and being able to start to rebuild a neighborhood that is really designed for that inclusive and equitable, you know, ideal that we're thinking of. The houses that she's developing, you know, she's able to accommodate the senior that's living in subsidized housing to the new, you know, family that wants that first home that's still affordable. So I guess I would just say that I beg to differ, that I don't think that we're that far apart. The lens may be a little bit different, but with the issue around equity is still a big issue.
I think that ground was covered very well. The only thing that I'll add, and I spend a lot of time thinking about equity. I'm a nonprofit real estate developer, so I think about equity in terms of housing and community development, but I'm also an elected school board member, so I think about equity in terms of access to education and the future of the children in Detroit. And equity, and specifically the lack of equity, is one of the biggest threats to what is happening in Detroit. I firmly believe that Detroit has this amazing opportunity to really get it right. Like, we're not landlocked like Manhattan. We're not rapidly growing like the DC area. We know when we hit our rock bottom moment, that was the bankruptcy, and we can learn lessons from all of these other places that have grappled with gentrification and lost that fight. And I really do believe we can win it and we can get it right in Detroit. But it does represent this moment of risk. And I agree with September that a big component of it really is the socioeconomic inequity. But I also think that it would be telling just a part of the story if I didn't also lift up the role that access to power plays, particularly on racial lines. Detroit was a very unique place to grow up in. Like I grew up there, I went to public schools. I could literally go weeks and not see a white person because everybody that was in a position of leadership, all of my teachers, they were all Black. And so the power structure was completely Black. And that's not the case now. And that is deeply troubling for a lot of Detroiters who have spent their lives in that environment. And so one of the biggest risks is kind of thinking about like not just what does the future of Detroit look like, but who's at the table really making those decisions? Who gets to access capital? Who gets to decide where the resources are going? Who gets to shape retail downtown? And who is it for? Who are the restaurants for? And those are the kind of questions that are really just below the surface in Detroit across the entire city and really are one of the biggest threats. And Maurice is right, like that is kind of, that's the thing that we all really have to keep front and center because it is one of the biggest risk factors in my opinion.
And I would say that one of the things that Detroit understood, the mayor understood that the future of Detroit was not solely on reviving the downtown and neighborhoods that happen to be adjacent to downtown, because those are quickly gentrifying areas. The real future of Detroit were in neighborhoods that were miles away from downtown, which were not on the fancy queue line, or they didn't have the access to just being geographically in the sweet spot. And I would argue in Chicago, the Loop, the South Loop, the West Loop, all that is the luck of geography. And if the city only had a strategy having to do with downtown and downtown adjacent, then Chicago will continue to be the largest global city that's losing population still. So I think one of the lessons from Detroit that Chicago can learn from is it's about the neighborhoods. It's about the neighborhoods. In the end, quality of life in neighborhoods that are far from downtown have to be strong. You have to give people a reason to stay. And it's not by chance that the areas that are losing population by the hundreds of thousands are on the south side and on the west side, and they happen to be neighborhoods of people of color. So Chicago has to reset the conversation and think of kind of both and. Yes, you can tend to the heart of your city, which is the downtown, but you can also tend to the soul of the city, which are these neighborhoods. And so the mayor has figured that out, and she ran on a platform of equitable development, redistributing how development happens so that neighborhoods on the south side and neighborhoods on the west side, their assets are lifted up and the quality of life in those neighborhoods are just as exceptional as the north and the northwest side. We've got a long way to go because we've got 50 years of systemic disinvestment to overcome. But I think Detroit figured it out. I mean, if you look at where the growth areas are, they're all miles from downtown. And that's where the attention really needs to be. Doing both. I really do think you can do both at the same time.
You're going to find out. I think this is something that was very compelling to me about Lori Lightfoot's initial statements of what she cared about. She cared about neighborhoods. And I think most people don't really understand that what that secretly means is I'm not going to worry so much about downtown business development. I'm not going to worry about bringing in these international corporations and World Business Chicago, which still exists. It's great. But that you're right, it's both and. But that if you don't say neighborhoods and if you don't bring them up, it's not both and, that's right? So you have what now, 3.5 years in this role? Maybe more?
I'm hoping more. I'm assuming she's got to get reelected because we're going to do what we said we would do.
Well, I mention this because you guys are in Detroit potentially you could be there for 20 years. You could be there for 5. But you have the opportunity, because of the sectors you're working in, to see long-term change and to make decisions that affect long-term change. And I think when you're in an elected office, you have to balance what you know is right in the long term for what is going to satisfy and keep your constituents engaged in the short term. So I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about how these time frames affect the way you think about your work.
I'll be happy to jump in. So when we announced over the summer that we would reach $200 million by the end of 2022, that put us on a time frame. We had already been invested over 5 years, and when we hit the 150, we had to take a pause to think about, so what have we accomplished? The money's gone out, we've helped stand up organizations, we're having impact, but where are we at in terms of where we want the city to be? And so as a result of that, we realized that we weren't done and that we wanted to be able to do more. And so over the next 3 years, we're really pivoting our strategy to think more about this issue of equity, and with more intentionality around how we can help more long-term Detroiters, explicitly African-American families, be able to have more access to economic mobility, and thinking about what are the levers that we can use philanthropy to support to be able to drive people in that direction. And so for us, it's thinking about how do we increase the number of homeowners. At one point, Detroit had some of the highest rates of Black home ownership, and now it's a renter majority city. So thinking about that as asset building to support more people to be able to build a stronger financial foundation is thinking about financial health. Detroit is a city where 66% of the residents have subprime or no credit. 68% have delinquent debt. So thinking about how we can better support Detroiters build stronger financial foundations through financial coaching, access to checking and savings accounts, thinking about the workforce challenges, which we haven't solved. We made a lot of progress, but how can we start to connect more Detroiters to work that's future-proof? Because automation is coming. So how do we better partner with other foundations that have now entered the market, like Ralph C. Wilson, the Barmer Group, that have spin-down accounts that are going to far exceed what we'll do in Detroit, and thinking about how can we better align. So I think for us, it's, while we'll continue to be invested in Detroit for as long as we're there as a firm, we're now at this pivotal point where we're winding down and having to be more intentional about our investment to really look up in 3 years to say, how have we supported more Black Detroiters be able to have stronger financial foundations? How are we moving more people to the middle class?
Mm-hmm. I love this question. So let me start by saying I'm in Detroit for the long haul. I'm back home. I'm very happy to be back. It's a really exciting place to be working, so I'm there for the long haul. If you think about what happened in my career, I go into a quasi-government role during the bankruptcy, and I make a very intentional decision to come back out and do community-oriented work from the outside, running a nonprofit. And I was very intentional in that because government comes with certain constraints that aren't necessarily present in the private sector, i.e., in some ways, with my housing work, I can just simply move faster with a little less political minutia than if I were inside government, and that actually matters. And so I see myself as a partner to government, and I like that I can do my work without the layers of political calculus that come with being an elected official. And I'm in a position where I can contrast that because I actually am an elected official on the school board. And my baseline personality is, can we just fix stuff? Can we just do the right thing and fix it, right? that is who I am at my core. And I'll be up for election next year on the 2020 ballot, and we'll see how that goes. We'll see how that plays. I don't know.
Yeah, there's nothing like an election timeline to deliver. So I know I've been an elected official, I've been a mayor and a city council, and I can't tell you how much that pressure of being able to not just talk about quality of life, but actually demonstrate it. You have to move the needle. People have to be able to come out of their house and say something is different today because of something you did. And so, yeah, we have 3.5 years to show whether we can move the needle on the quality of life in the south side of Chicago and the west side. And it's so complicated, right? Because it has to deal with issues of, security and, violence. It has issues to do with job opportunities for people who have been out of the economy for a while. It has to do with giving people places to shop and do the normal things that people do day to day. We take them all for granted. If you live in certain parts of the south side and the west side, you cannot take those things for granted. It's about quality of housing, both new housing. It's about housing choice in a neighborhood. So we don't have to solve 50 years of Chicago's problems in 3, but we have to give tangible, demonstrable evidence that progress is being made. So I think of things in real, tangible terms. That's why, I'm a planning director, and I say the last thing we need is another plan. Mm-hmm. We need action. Mm-hmm. We need actionable evidence that government can make a difference. Government can partner with the private sector, with philanthropy, with the corporate sector. And it's a kind of all hands on deck approach. And so that's what we're gonna try to do. And that, I think, we can do in 3.5 years and set the stage and the foundation for systemic change that will last, hopefully a generation.
All right. With that, we're opening this up to Q&A. I want to remind you that the first 3 questions need to come from you Chicago students. Come on.
That should be no
that
problem.
Means the students gotta get up.
Well, thanks for coming. This is kind of a planning question specifically. What you said at the end about the development being a few miles away from downtown and away from public transportation, like a trolley line or whatever that they have there. I've never been to Detroit. Given the climate crisis we have and the opportunity to start again, is that really sustainable environmentally to be developing Detroit again? It seems like a car city, stuff spread miles apart, not a lot of public transportation,
right.
Or could this be an opportunity to try a new model for the American city?
No, I appreciate the question. I mean, Detroit is the motor city, and people made it very clear to me that they're not all getting on bikes, so that I should probably take into account the full spectrum of transportation options. But Detroit, unlike Chicago, didn't build a subway system. And so, and it's not going to build a subway system. It is going to have to diversify its transit within its means. The low-hanging fruit, quite frankly, was bicycles and bicycle paths, and we built more protected bike lanes in 1 year. I mean, the most of any American city. So we are already trying to share the road. It generates a smile because folks are like, this is the motor city. I want to park in front of the establishment. It's like, no, we're going to make space for other modes and share the road. And then we're going to explore transportation options which are within our means. So express buses, dedicated bus lanes, things, we're a poor city and we're going to try to work within our means. But if we had pursued a strategy that the only neighborhoods that mattered were the neighborhoods that were adjacent to downtown, that could be serviced by the streetcar or by a network of bike lanes, we would have left out 130 square miles of the city, and we would have concentrated on that remaining 7, which effectively had been the policy. And so we said, no, we're going to concentrate on neighborhoods that are miles away, and we're going to grow those neighborhoods again. And guess what? It begs the question, how are you going to connect them to downtown? So it forces a conversation about transit. But the first thing we had to prove is that we could improve the quality of life in neighborhoods again. And you didn't have to have the luck of being adjacent to downtown to live in a socially, economically, and environmentally healthy neighborhood.
Can I just say the one thing that Maurice isn't saying is that the bike lanes, and he's absolutely right on the bike lanes, but the bike lanes made him a highly controversial figure.
It was such a simple idea.
My father called me up, and my parents live about as far from downtown as you can get and still be in the city. And he called up one day and it's like, who is this Maurice Cox? And why is he taking a lane out of I gotta go talk to him. So yeah, it was the right thing to do, but that's
very controversial.
That is a really tough conversation to have in Detroit.
Yeah, still is, but we're baking it into the DNA, so there's gonna be no getting rid of them.
Hi, my name is Liz. I'm here at the University of Chicago getting my master's in public policy as well as an MBA. So I am kind of trying to focus on, I'm a lifelong Chicagoan, so I do want to work in promoting equity in the city of Chicago. And I want to figure out a way to do that from both a policy standpoint and a business standpoint. So I'm wondering if I could just hear from you guys and I'd like to potentially work in housing, so I'd like to focus on housing. What housing policies, what are some examples of good policy that worked in Detroit, and what are some examples, maybe from you, Sonia, of good, I guess, strategies and implementation strategies for affordable worked in Detroit?
Yeah, that's such an interesting combination. I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about some of the ideas you have on how you're going to leverage both of those, but I really like that combination. My response to that is, one of the things that's been really cool about doing housing work in Detroit in this moment is that the community in Detroit has really figured out how to leverage this notion of a public-private partnership. And when I landed in Detroit six and a half years ago, it wasn't the most collaborative place I had worked. I could, on a single day, I could meet a group that was doing one thing on one side of the city and a group that was doing the exact same thing on the other side. And if they could just figure out how to talk to each other, they could probably do twice as much with half the resource, right? And so that was the environment. Now, in part because of the way in which philanthropy has really stepped up and positioned itself as a coordinator across government and corporate issues, if you will, it makes for some really, really interesting possibilities. My own organization was actually launched out of this very notion of a public-private partnership. So a group of government leaders came together with a group of corporate leaders, came together with a group of foundation leaders, including JPMorgan Chase, and helped to create this organization that had a very specific purpose of being able to go into Detroit's neighborhoods, not focused on downtown, not focused on the central business district, but really go into these harder hit neighborhoods and be that first prong of investment, to go in and say, you know what, there's a lot of fabric in this neighborhood that still exists. There are really strong residents here. Capital has been scared away for a whole host of reasons, but there's both interest in moving in this neighborhood, and there's good fabric, and how can we collaboratively pull all the resources together through my organization to make that happen? So I think what you're probably looking for in terms of just overarching policy are places where you can kind of sit at this intersection between public-private investment.
And I would just add, in terms of things that you might want to look into that we're doing in Detroit, we'll have to look up in a few years to see how well it's working, is just being able to tie affordable housing targets or goals to funding that's available. So ensuring that, I think on average, if you get like from the Strategic Neighborhood Fund, 20% of the housing has to be at least 60 to 80% AMI. So, as I'm sure you're already aware, affordable housing is very expensive to build. And so being more intentional about how, as you're putting up new developments, to ensure that there is mixed income. We also have a new affordable housing leverage fund with the specific intentional purpose of preserving 10,000 units of affordable housing, as well as creating 2,000 new units. So just thinking differently about how you are putting kind of targets aligned with capital sources.
And I should say, I wasn't trying to purposely dodge your question about specific policies. And I can talk to you offline. I actually think that housing policy is really best addressed at the federal level. I think it's really hard to kind of move the needle at the local level with housing policy.
And I'm just going to add a short strategy that Detroit deployed with its basic premise that the most affordable housing that you can create is the affordable housing that you already have, that it's a lot easier to preserve affordable housing than to create new product. And based on that, when we went in and decided to do a series of public investments in a neighborhood that we knew was probably going to have an impact of raising rents, more ownership, we took a scan of all of the federally subsidized housing in that geography and when they were going to expire, and made a commitment to extend their life for the next 30 years before we did any physical improvements. So folks knew that they were going to be a part of that neighborhood 30 years from now, because the city, with partnerships, found the resources to make sure that we didn't displace those who were already there. So a lot of times it was like, give us the assurance, show us that this is actually for us, and then, we'll be a little more willing to allow others to come into the neighborhood.
And I'm going to plug very quickly that the Mansueto Institute has a housing fellowship for students like you. It's called the Kreisman Housing Fellowship. If you're here next year, you should apply for it.
Okay, so my name's Andre. I'm a first-year MPP at the Harris School of Public Policy, and I actually just graduated from the University of Michigan just this past May.
Go Blue.
Go Blue. Hopefully win that game today. But anyway, so speaking of universities, so over my past 4 years at Michigan, I've noticed and observed, the ways in which the university has been engaging in some respects with the city of Detroit. And, Michigan takes a lot of pride in its universities, whether it's the University of Michigan, Michigan State, or Wayne State. So in your opinions, what role have the universities been playing in the resurgence of Detroit through investments, programs, and initiatives? And what role should they be playing in the resurgence of Detroit? Thank you.
That's a great question. And I think there's some really fascinating partnerships that are emerged. One that you may have heard of is University of Michigan is creating an innovation center in an area that was supposed to have a jail and is now going to be developed as a piece of the city that allows those who graduate from the state schools to actually have a place to innovate within the state of Michigan instead of having to come to Chicago. So that partnership has been forged. I think it'll be amazing, and the first real effort by the University of Michigan to plant its tent downtown. Another interesting initiative is a 0 to 20 campus on Marygrove. This is about 6 miles from the downtown, where with a partnership with the Detroit Public Schools, an early childhood learning center from 0 to 4, and a connection to the University of Michigan as a kind of teaching component, you will be able, from 0 to 20, have your education on this gorgeous campus. It's one of the first times that they pulled those together. So that's another example of the university kind of stepping into a leadership role and partnering with the city. And I can name, Wayne State. I can name University of Detroit Mercy. All of the universities have kind of stepped in. And Cranbrook, which is trying desperately to now find a place in the new Detroit narrative there in Bloomfield, and it's a long ways away. So, but it's really been fascinating to watch these universities who made their brand that on We're Not Detroit, all trying to find a way to get involved in what they see clearly is a kind of transformational moment for the city.
Hi, my name is Sofia, and I'm a second-year undergraduate studying political science at the college. I was born and raised in Plymouth, but my dad's family is from Dearborn, and it's been really fascinating for me to see not only sort of the generational divide in views about the city of Detroit, but even just the divide from the Detroit area coming to the Chicago area, how Detroit is viewed colloquially. And I was wondering, in your opinion, for young people who are from Detroit, who are interested in public service, and who want to help the city or get involved in this revitalization, what advice would you give to young people like me who want to get involved, but maybe live farther away or have parents that maybe don't know if it's possible?
Well, advice that I would give is move to Detroit. I think there's no better way to demonstrate kind of your desire and commitment to helping rebuild a city other than being there. But I think something that you could do now is just be an ambassador for Detroit. I think that the perception of the city historically has been one where success meant that you got out. So being able to be a part of this new trend where we're talking about how amazing the city is, what the comeback looks like, the amazing people that are doing the work there, and just being able to kind of counter that old narrative, I think is something that you could do today, as well as being able to donate to organizations that are in Detroit that are doing great work, which I know is a little bit harder as a student, but something you could think of once you get your next job.
I'd like to welcome the three of you to Chicago. Mr. Cox, I'm looking forward to great plans coming. My name's Kenneth Newman. I'm a local resident. I'm on 5 park advisory councils, and the Chicago Park District is facing an awful lot of challenges, including the lakefront, which you must be aware of. I am aware of park problems citywide because of other work I'm related to. Do you have plans yet, or are you looking at neighborhoods that don't have parks, and what do you plan to do to change those communities? Because when a park is in a community, it makes the home values go up.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think parks are a big piece of kind of quality of life amenities. I'm talking about parks where your children don't have to cross a 6-lane highway to get to, that you would entrust them to ride their bike to a neighborhood park. And Chicago has an amazing system of parks. The level of investment has not been equitable, a reinvestment in them. So, I've toured some things that I thought, we should kind of do an equity assessment of how Chicago has invested in its parks across maybe even decades to see if we need to recalibrate those investments to make up for oversights. So we talk about that a lot, but it's a part of the menu that I think we all probably spent some time in our youth in a neighborhood park that we loved, and so I would just say that the way that the Lightfoot administration has structured the challenge is to bring all of these divisions together literally every 2 weeks and talk about how we are going to invest in neighborhoods. So there's a much more aligned conversation than I think has ever happened before. And I think that's promising for the thing that you care about, these parks.
Hi, my name is Barbara Reynolds. I grew up in Austin, and I have a degree in planning from UIC.
Awesome.
And what troubles me, and I know this is a problem you had in Detroit, that on any square block in many of the neighborhoods away from the city, maybe 15% of the housing is still existent and occupied. How do you create, and
I didn't, can you say that again?
That maybe on a square block, maybe a total of 15 to 20% of the homes are still standing and occupied. So density, you don't have the benefit of density in those communities.
Okay.
I know you had the 20-minute quality of life concept. And I wonder, when you have communities that are low income and not dense, how do you overcome that problem in terms of providing basic services when you don't have money or density?
Sure.
No,
I think that's a great question, and it's a question, quite frankly, that Detroit has struggled with mightily, far more than what Chicago has. Detroit, I think even during the time that I was there, 20,000 houses were demolished. They were averaging 100 houses a week being demolished. And there's still another 25,000 houses that the mayor has wanted to get demolished. And so I think it's really hard to bring back a neighborhood that doesn't have residential density. I don't have any magic bag of tricks.
Yeah.
I really don't. And so one of the realities was just, being straight with residents that we need an interim strategy until those populations come back. We can maybe make the best garden neighborhood imaginable using that vacant land, not just throwing some grass seed and setting up this unsustainable mowing regime in perpetuity. I don't think that's a strategy. So we started talking about alternative uses for vacant land. What would it be like to live in a garden community that is low density? And yes, you may not be able to walk to the corner store and get a cafe because you don't have the residential. But there are hundreds of millions, tens of millions of Americans that live in rural America, and they have quite a nice lifestyle, and they don't walk to the corner Starbucks.
But they can afford cars.
That's right. So yes, it's a complex question, and I don't think there are easy answers, but I do think that there are strategies. They have a different timeline than other areas, and I think you have to come to the question with a different set of tools that may be unconventional.
Thank you.
We have time for 2 more questions. I'm sorry to the rest of you in the line. 2 more questions.
First of all, thank you all for being here. I come with a different angle. I grew up on both sides of 8 Mile, in Oakland County and in Wayne County for many years. Came here to Chicago, got both my BA and my MBA here in health administration policy. So I love both of these cities deeply and appreciate what you've had to say. There are 2 things I really haven't heard you talk about except tangentially. One is the relationship between the city of Detroit and its suburbs and how that has changed, how you see it changing. Will we ever get away from what was created on both sides of we're going to have a healthy donut around a falling apart city? So that's one question. The second is healthcare. Your mayor is a former head of the Detroit Medical Center, as I understand it, right? Dr. King said of all the forms of inequality, the most shocking and inhuman is in healthcare, the unfairness in healthcare. So how are both Chicago, and I started at Cook County Hospital, got to add that in there. How are you all seeing healthcare fitting into this? How are you seeing city-suburban connections fitting into both cities?
I'll at least try to tackle the first one and possibly the second one. So the question of regionalization is a really big topic in Detroit, in the Detroit area, and always has been. It's been referenced a couple times. Detroit is predominantly Black and socioeconomically poorer than the surrounding suburbs. Some of our suburbs are incredibly affluent. As recently as 5-10 years ago, Oakland County, which was mentioned here, was one of the top 10 wealthiest counties in the whole country. That's the legacy of auto money. And so there is this real dichotomy between city and suburb. I will say for the first time in my life, that's starting to thaw a little bit. We now have leadership in the suburban counties that really are recognizing the importance of regionalization. Like, the worst thing that can happen to our suburbs from their perspective is that everybody packs up and leaves the suburbs and moves back to the urban core and just, you know what I mean? Like, and they get that, right? Because they spent their lives watching the reverse happen as people moved out of Detroit. And so I think that realization and seeing it happen, like, young people are doing something very different than they've done in a generation. And they're choosing to move into urban cores en masse. And I think seeing that is forcing people who used to be very rigid about that 8 Mile line to think differently. Healthcare, I don't have much for you. We completely whiff on that. Detroit we just do. It's in my opinion, it's repugnant. We have the city has one of the highest, if not the country's highest infant mortality rate. We just have abysmal health markers, and it's deeply tied to how poor the city is. And I wish I had better answers for you. I'm not a health policy person, though. I don't know if you have. I don't know if you've done any work there. But.
No, we don't really focus on healthcare. However, I will say that just in conversations that I've had with some of the health system networks, there is, I think, more of an interest in trying to think about how they show up as an anchor and thinking about the impact they could have in the neighborhoods surrounding their hospitals. So I'm hoping that in the future we'll see kind of more investment in collaboration to better support kind of health outcomes, but
yeah, I'll say there is an opportunity, as negative as I sounded, there's a real opportunity there actually, and there's a whole host of people nationally trying to think about how to tear that wall down between housing and healthcare, because those two sectors really ought to be talking to each other and collaborating and thinking about how to innovate so that you can solve problems that really come out of people's living conditions and affect their health.
And unfortunately, and I'm so sorry to our last questioner, we are out of time.
Well, we will take your questions after the show.
Oh, you guys are great. Can we just have a round of applause for our panelists? Thank you so much.